Hi everyone, this is going to be part 1 for our lecture of chapter 16, which goes over concentration. So the key question or kind of the underlying theme for this lecture, I want you guys to think of, well, why would concentration be important in my career? If it's going to be in sports psychology, concentration is extremely useful for, a useful skill that we can teach, but it's also useful for us when we're thinking about coming up with activities or PSTs that we want to work with people. We need to stay in the moment, that kind of element. If we go back to the title slide here, these are just kind of some goofy examples, but I think they're kind of helpful. Athletes definitely need to have this skill, this concentration or the ability to attend to specific cues. Surgeons definitely need to have the capacity to stay in a moment of attention for prolonged periods. And then even things like physical activity or exercisers such as the weightlifter here. If you think about it, if you've ever done some weightlifting, a lot of times people or a trainer will tell you need to focus or really attend to which muscle groups or muscles you're flexing and that kind of thing through a movement to make sure you're really working out the correct muscles. So that's kind of the underlying key or question for this lecture. But the outline, oh, come on, computer, go with me here. There we go. The outline that we're going to cover is we're going to introduce what is concentration, what about concentration and performance, how are they related, types of attentional focus, attentional problems. We're going to talk a bit about choking as a specific attentional problem. We'll talk about self-talk or that internal monologue. And then lastly, we're going to talk about tips for improving concentration on site, or what we might call in situ, which is just a way of saying in the situation or during the event. So what is concentration? Well, you heard me say it a few times there on the past couple slides where I basically said concentration and attention are the same thing. And for our purposes, they will be, because a lot of times when we say, oh, I want you to concentrate on this task, we're really saying, I want you to attend to this. Put all of your attention on this. So the actual definition we'll stick to is concentration is the mental effort placed on sensory or mental events. It is the person's ability to exert deliberate mental effort on what is most important in a given situation. So you can kind of see how that's going to link to attention, and definitely how it's going to be important for optimal performance, whether it's an athlete or even an exerciser. There are 4 main components to concentration. So the first one being focusing on relevant environmental cues. Okay, that's important because a lot of times in our environment, we kind of talked about this in a previous lecture, there can be a lot going on. So what we need to do is have a bit of selective attention. So we're able to pull out from an environment the cues or the things going on that are actually important to performing some skill. Okay. The next component is maintaining attentional focus, which is pretty straightforward. Situation awareness, and this is the ability to understand what is going on around you. Okay, so is it a situation that has a lot of pressure, a lot of anxiety, that kind of thing? So is there going to be a lot more environmental cues for you to take in, or is it something like practice where it's just you and your teammates going through a walkthrough of the practice or the next game coming up? And then the last one we have is shifting attentional focus when necessary. I generally call this set shifting. So this is the ability to really go from focusing on one thing, putting all your attention on one thing, the ability to actually shift your attention to something else. Maybe to the next environmental cue if it's some kind of sequence. But if it's more dynamic like sport, then that means we're actually shifting from one component of the sport to the next. So maybe it's going from watching a pitcher pitch to knowing when you're supposed to run, when you're supposed to check back to the base, those kind of things. So there are two strategies for using concentration. These are big ones. It's mentioned in the textbook. So it's this idea of association and dissociation. Associative attention strategy. So this is used a lot of times by runners. They're a great example here where the person will actually monitor bodily functions or how they're feeling. Okay, so they're thinking about their heart rate. They're attending to their breathing, and the muscle tension, or even some of the fatigue that they're feeling in their muscles. But then there's dissociative attentional strategy, which is kind of the other end of the extreme. So again, these might be runners if we stay with that sample, but these are runners who actually don't pay attention to their heart rate, their breathing, that kind of thing. So when they start to feel tension, they start to feel that soreness, their legs are turn into jelly, that kind of thing. They try to focus on anything except for that feeling or how hard they're breathing or something like that. So they're trying to dissociate their thinking away from what their body's going through. Okay. Now I want you to think of these as kind of two poles of an extreme or a spectrum, or even what it says here, a continuum. So at one end we have this associative type, and then at the other end we have this dissociative. And the reason I want you to think of it this way is people don't generally ascribe or use just one. There are some individuals who train to use only one type, but that doesn't mean that's the only type the person uses. I'm sure there are elite marathon runners who are really good at attending to their heart rate, their breathing, the tension in their muscles that they feel, but at the same time, they're probably dissociating a little bit, okay? It's not that they're going to be mutually exclusive. You can actually be a little bit, you can utilize strategies from both type, okay? So what does the research say that's out there? Again, this has to do with running. There's been some research suggesting that runners who use this associative strategy actually tend to run faster, okay? But like I just said, these runners don't just use associative strategies. They tend to use both associative and dissociative. Dissociation does not increase the probability of injury. So again, think of this, you have this, maybe you start to get a cramp in your calf while you're running and you just try to ignore it. It doesn't necessarily increase the chances of you getting an injury, but it's not exactly a great strategy to ascribe to, right? Because we should be listening to our bodies. But what this strategy can do is it can actually decrease fatigue or a sense of fatigue because they're trying to not pay attention to it. Let's see here. What's this last one say? So dissociation should be used by individuals who want to increase their adherence to exercise. So that's another one, because a lot of times people who are just beginning exercise programs or just getting into a sport are going to get really, really focused on kind of the sucky element of this, right? So if you think of someone who's just beginning a weightlifting program, a day, 2 days after they've lifted for the first time really hard, they get DOMS, they have a lot of soreness going on, but they know that they need to go out and they need to run or they need to stretch, they need to do this, that, and another thing. So you could see how a dissociation strategy could actually be helpful then, right? Because then the soreness is actually a good thing, right? It lets us know that we put a lot of strain in our body and now we're recovering. So I need to be out and use some active rest, so go for a light jog. So trying to put out of your mind that soreness, okay? So that's really helpful as opposed to this associative strategy where you're going to pay attention to that soreness, okay? So let's talk a little bit about concentration and optimal performance. There's a bit of this in the book, okay? Elite athletes' peak performance is associated with, this is probably no surprise, but being absorbed in the present and having no thoughts about past or future, okay? So really living in the moment, being aware of all that's going on around them, being mentally relaxed and having a high degree of concentration and control. And then lastly, being in a state of extraordinary awareness of both the body and external environment. So that's talking about those environmental cues. So I don't think this is anything crazy, earth-shattering, anything like that. But it's just good to note that elite athletes really are able to do this a lot better than just kind of Joe Schmo who's just getting into an activity program or playing sport for the first time. Okay, because there's a lot of information that has to be taken in, and what should we attend to, what shouldn't we, that kind of thing. And elite athletes really have figured this out. So let's talk a little bit more about that, this difference between experts and novices, okay, or the newbies in attentional processing. So again, this is taking in the environmental cues, okay. So experts tend to make faster decisions, and they're a lot better at actually anticipating future events. And you can think of that because if we're dealing with experts, they've probably seen things a million times, or what seems like a million times. So if that's the case, they've been put in a lot of different situations where they've had to make different decisions, maybe where they've been successful and where they've failed. So they've learned what decisions are needed, or what responses are needed for certain outcomes to be reached. Experts tend to attend to movement patterns more, so you can think of a Major League Baseball batter, okay? They're actually able to tell you what kind of pitch the pitcher is throwing simply by the placement of their hand and the follow-through, okay? And because of that's because they don't have a lot of time to react and know when they need to swing or where they need to swing, that kind of stuff. So experts tend to be tend to be a lot better at attending to movement patterns. Experts tend to search more systematically for cues, so they're searching for little keys to the environment in their own manner, but it's usually systematically, so they go through the same steps each time. They selectively attend to the structure inherent to sport, okay, nothing crazy there, and are more skillful in predicting ball flight patterns. Okay, so again, this is kind of the baseball example here. So, but you have to remember, to be experts, they're spending 10,000 hours in practice and that kind of thing to be considered an expert. So they've seen a lot of different scenarios. So now they've kind of learned what kind of responses are necessary for certain outcomes to be achieved. So now what we're going to talk about are some theories that go along with information processing or attention and such, so taking in the environmental cues. The first one is single channel theory. This is a pretty old theory. The idea here is information is processed through a single and fixed capacity channel. So basically we take in information, it goes through a very simple unidirectional model where it's just coming in, we're filtering all of the information and putting out some response. Okay, so this one, don't really pay attention or worry too much about this. A lot of times you'll see it called an all or nothing theory of attention. We're not going to focus on that one. We'll focus a bit more on these later ones, such as the variable allocation theory. So the idea here is that individuals are able to be flexible to what they attend to, right? So they can choose what they're going to focus their attention on. So if there's multiple things that they need to pay attention to, then they can actually determine or be flexible in what they're allocating their concentration to. Now, the multiple resource pool theory is pretty complex. Okay, so the idea here is attention is distributed throughout the nervous system, kind of like microprocessors, or it's one way of thinking about it, with each microprocessor having its own unique capabilities and resource performance relationship. So basically what we're trying to say is there's different components to kind of your ability to attend and concentrate on elements and pay attention to certain environmental cues, and then some kind of output or performance. So this can lead to elements such as input, output, modalities, so how things are coming in, how we're reacting. It could be how we're coding this information, so is it visual, spatial, these kind of elements. And the idea here is the closer that if we're doing multiple tasks and the two tasks are close in these different microprocessors or different elements, okay, then we'll actually be able to perform or or attend to cues better, as opposed to something very different. Okay, so you can think of this here. Try and think of a good example. So an example of this might be cell phone, talking on your cell phone and driving a car. Okay, so talking and attending or watching the road, so taking in that input, actually those go together well, right? That's something that human beings we've done for a long time. Okay, but if we look at a different modality, right, of communication, maybe texting and driving, we see that all of a sudden we're pulling our attention away from the road to visually look at our phone. We have to process the information coming off the phone as opposed to processing the information on the road. We need to have an output, right? So we have to actually type in our message, press send, and then we're back to the road. So it's a pretty big shift between the road and texting and actually talking on the phone and driving. Now, I'm not advocating for talking on the phone and driving, but still, just kind of an example here. If you can multitask and actually keep the what we call here microprocessors focused on their key elements, where it's not pulling us away, we'll be able to attend better and actually react and have some kind of performance that is better, as opposed to something that's very separate, okay, such as texting and driving. Oh, come on, computer. There we go. So what are some theoretical notions? Kind of a big one is this idea of attentional selectivity. So the idea here is we're just letting some information into our processing system, so into our mind, while other information is screened and ignored, right? So the idea here is we're not going to be able to attend to everything, but we can pull out information that is important. Okay, so there's some errors here, right? So if we're attending to too much information, right, too many things, then we're going to be distracted from what's really important from the environment. We could also say, well, maybe there's some irrelevant cues or things going on in the environment that are going to pull us away from what's really important. And then lastly, the inability to actually shift, right? Do that set shifting of focus rapidly enough, because remember, a lot of sport and physical activity is very quick in nature. So that being the case, we need to be able to shift from one set of cues maybe to another. We have to do that quickly in order to perform at an optimal level. There's also the idea of attentional capacity. Okay, so this talks about the fact that attention is limited, right? It's not like we have this unlimited amount of attention. So there's only so much information we can really process and attend to at one time. So then there's this idea of controlled processing, which is where we as individuals are consciously paying attention or trying to be aware of what we're doing in a sport skill. But then there's things like automatic processing, where maybe we've done something so many times before that we're able to process the information, the cues in the environment unconsciously, right? So an idea here is, I know me, I've been driving a bit this summer, so drive down to Nashville or something like that. It's about an 8.5-hour drive. There are definitely stretches in there, right, where you just kind of go, oh wow, we've already gone 50 miles. It felt like 5, and it's just because it's automatic for you to drive down the road. You're not attending to everything. You're pulling out the important cues and that kind of stuff. There's also, attentional capacity, a little bit more on that. What we know is that athletes can actually change from this controlled processing to automatic pretty easily, and that makes sense, right? Because automatic seems like it's just something that you need to practice. If it's a new skill or a new sport, the more you play it or the more you practice it, the more familiar you are with the environmental cues and what's going on with your body. So you'll be able to actually have more automatic processing later on. So you can kind of tell that automatic processing is less restrictive than controlled processing, simply because the controlled processing is when we're really attending to what we're doing. Think of it as a little bit more clunky just because we're not being as efficient as possible. There's also attentional alertness. Okay, so this is increases in emotional arousal, narrows our attentional field, right? This isn't anything crazy, but basically the higher our focus is, or our alertness, our ability to focus or narrow our focus on specific cues becomes heightened. Okay, so the second bullet here, arousal of attentional narrowing, is an example where one loses sensitivity to cues in the peripheral field with increased emotional arousal, so that mental arousal. So look at this picture. This athlete has probably been in this situation a million times before, right? It's UNC and Duke. The UNC player completely blocking out the fans, right? And they are basically on the court in his ear. Okay, and it doesn't even look like he realizes they're there. And this happens a great bit. I mean, great bit in basketball, just because of how much the fans really play a role, and they can be right down there on the court. So let's go back to concentration and optimal performance. So, some other elements that we need to focus on is that focusing on only the relevant cues in an athletic environment is key, and we want to be able to eliminate distractions. And also, in tandem with that, we want to have the ability to automatically process the information that's coming from our environment and execute specific movements or behaviors that are critical to our performance, right? Kind of makes sense. So that's the end of part 1. Make sure you move on to part 2, and we'll wrap up chapter 16.